Good evening, everyone. I'm very excited for tonight's episode of Learning with My Rabbis. We have Rabbi Richard Camras with us. He's been the rabbi at Shomrei Torah Synagogue in Woodland Hills, California for, I think, almost 3 decades now, as well as he teaches 2 decades. He teaches he's been a rabbi for 3 decades, been there for 2, and teaches at the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies to final year rabbinical students, some very practical rabbinics. And most importantly of all, he's my rabbi. It's the synagogue I grew up with, and the rabbi I still see and feel like I'm 3 feet tall at my bar mitzvah standing next to him. So it's really great to have you with us, Rabbi.
Well, Rabbi Sachs, first of all, I love the name Rabbi Sachs because you've always been Lewis to me, but the fact that you are a rabbi of such a prestigious congregation in Toronto is really remarkable. And kol hakavod to you, and how fortunate are your congregants to be able to learn from you and seek out your wisdom, and most importantly, your gentleness of spirit, your kindness, and your all-around menschlichkeit. So I am sure the congregation has learned very quickly what a gift you are to their community and what a blessing you probably are to the larger Toronto Jewish community.
Wow, thank you so much. You're making me blush here a little bit. I thought we would just dive in a little bit with just a little bit about your own story. What is it that brought you to the Rabbinate? How did you find your way there?
Yeah, there were probably 2 main strands. One was I grew up in Los Angeles, and I grew up at a really wonderful time for the conservative movement in the 70s. And there was just a plethora of opportunities for young people in Los Angeles in those days. There was Los Angeles Hebrew High, which still is, struggling along, which was an afternoon and evening continuing education program for high school students. There's Camp Ramah. There was a strong USY chapter, and I came from a very, very connected and committed synagogue, Sinai Temple. And so I grew up really with the richness of American Jewish, conservative Jewish life, with lots and lots of friends and really wonderful role models who gave me a very strong sense of belonging and identity and really a feeling of connection. And so I, in college worked as a USY director, and I taught religious school, and I spent a year in Israel, and I did all of those things that showed that I was a real product of the successes of our movement. So that's one strand that led me. But the second one, which was a very interesting alternative approach, was I spent a year and a half traveling in Asia after college with my sister. And traveling in those days is very different than traveling today. And we spent a great deal of time in various countries, living with people and learning from people. And one of the things that struck me was there was no division between a person, for example, who may have been a Buddhist, how they practiced their Buddhism in their home, in their place of worship, or on the street. There was a consistency about who they were, wherever it was that they found themselves. And I obviously didn't see that growing up. We were Jewish in the home, we were Jewish in the synagogue, but that wasn't necessarily the way we were in the street, in the workplace, that our Judaism didn't define us. It wasn't always the lens by which we viewed the world. And so one of the things that struck me in my travels was that dichotomy, that split, and I wanted to try to do something about that. And I had spent a great deal of time traveling with this gentleman who happened to be Jewish, but was a non-believer. He was an atheist, and we spent a lot of time arguing and talking, and I never thought that I was able to convince him or have the arguments or the philosophical underpinnings to be able to share with him the wisdom of my tradition. And he laughed at me when I would practice certain things, fasting on Yom Kippur or whatever it was. And so that's what motivated me to get a deeper education, go to rabbinical school, and then try to create an environment for my congregants that would bridge how they were as a Jew in the home versus how they were as a Jew on the street.
I I love that. One of the things when I look back on my time at Shomrei Torah is the cohort I grew up with. We had a very strong youth group. We had the teen madrachim program. We worked as counselors for the younger children. And when I look at my particular cohort, it seems to really defy the statistics. So many of them are Jews in their late 20s, early 30s who are very active still in different forms of Jewish life. Some are rabbis, some are now Orthodox congregants, but they, as opposed to the general trend of my generation kind of falling off the map of Jewish communal life, institutional life at least. So what is it? Is there something special in the water in Woodland Hills or Shomrei Torah? What was it? Like, I know for me it was impactful, but as the person shaping and crafting that, right, what was the secret that you had back then to getting us all involved so much?
Wow, it's a good question. I wish I could say to you there was a secret sauce. I don't think there was. I think it was a confluence of a number of events. Number one, I was coming from a community where I had spent a great deal of time thinking and dreaming about how to build Jewish community, particularly a youth community. I'd spent 7 years in a congregation in Baltimore where I had done just that. So I was filled with creativity, innovation, and a whole lot of energy. And I came to a synagogue where they were ready. The synagogue was in a transitional moment in its life. The senior rabbi had retired after 38 years. There had just been a merger of two synagogues. There had been, any number of crises, and the synagogue was looking to move and create an identity for itself, very different than what had existed prior to the merger of the two congregations. So they were ripe for change and for a person who could bring some kind of innovation and creativity. And I think a large part of the success was the willingness of my wife Carolyn and I to open up our homes, to be available to kids, to be mentors and role models, to not just preach a certain way of living, but live that way and be approachable and fun. So if you remember, we used to play a lot of ultimate frisbee and hang out at the park and play football. And I also recognize that USY, a youth program, is only one way to connect kids. There are so many avenues because kids have so many ideas and so many passions. And I think the synagogue has to be able to offer to all of the youth a way in which they can feel that they can bring their skills, their talents, and their passions and love into a Jewish framework. So we had lots of options for people. We had leadership programs, we had educational programs, we had social programs, and amongst all of those things, along with an intensity of presence through these activities, we were able to create a real energy around youth programming, and that led to a number of Jewish leaders. And as you said yourself, many of them moved on into, Orthodox forms of practice, which is a challenge the conservative movement, continues to struggle with. And many of them continued on. There were a number of rabbis who came out of the years that I was really focused on youth work. And so it's unbelievably gratifying. But I think if I had to say a secret sauce, it's a willingness to be innovative and creative, number one. And number two, to put yourself in the mix of it, to not rely on somebody else to do the work that needs to be done, which is about building relationships with the youth and letting them see that you deeply care about them and who they are and who you hope they will become.
I love that. I definitely remember as a kid playing games on Shabbat afternoons in the park. But I also just remember feeling comfortable in shul, feeling like I could come up on the bima and I could talk to you, that you were just available and approachable, maybe to a point where it was too much at some times, that you had teens that felt like we just walk up on the bima in the middle of services and say hi. But I always remember that and appreciated that. Thinking
I,
also the STAR program in particular, right, where we as Madrichim worked for the younger kids on Saturday mornings leading services. I remember you once telling me that it was actually more about the teens than it was about the younger kids. And programs like that, leadership programs, I think are a tremendous way. So I love that.
Yeah, I always felt that in order to be successful with teen groups, you need to have teens feel that they are responsible and in charge. And that responsibility then follows with a certain amount of obligation and trust. And so by putting kids in charge and giving them the confidence to be able to say, you can be Jewish educators. Not only are you feeling great about yourself and the impact that you have on the Jewish community, but you are then building a relationship with a younger kid who's looking up to you, saying, I want to be like Louis Sachs one day. I want to be the person who's got all of this energy and passion and commitment, and I want to teach my peers when I am older. And that's exactly what happened for any number of years. We had kids who were, being led by our teens who would graduate seventh grade, join our teen leadership community, and then go on to do the same thing. And that happened year after year after year. Unfortunately, times changed and life in synagogues changed and things became much more difficult and complicated. And we don't today offer the same kinds of opportunities that we did when you were growing up in the heyday of Shomrei Torah.
I remember talking to my brother recently, who was actually on the show as well, and he mentioned that for him a big part was always that he had to study and learn the tunes and everything and the prayers or whatever the parsha was, because he knew in 3 days he was going to be teaching it and he was going to be leading to it, which is a very different approach than trying to teach those same things in a classroom setting. Was that being driven? Now that you've been a rabbi for almost 3 decades, if I got that number right,
Yes,
I believe I read 1992 you were ordained.
correct.
What is something you wish you would have been taught in rabbinical school? I'm only a few years out, so I can hopefully get that in early before I have to learn it on my own.
Well, what I needed to learn versus what rabbis today need to learn is something totally different, because the rabbinate today and the rabbinate of tomorrow looks and is going to continue to look very different than the rabbinate that I was trained in. And, I think that the challenge that rabbinical schools have is that there's today the students who are coming to rabbinical school do not have the kind of backgrounds that the rabbinical students who were coming to rabbinical school 30 and 40 years ago had. So the rabbinical schools are obligated to have to teach at a level that requires a base learning. And that was assumed and understood to be part of a requirement for coming to rabbinical school at the time, which leaves very little time to be innovators, to teach about paradigm shifts, to teach about disruptive innovation, to teach about how to be entrepreneurial. And really, that's the challenge for the rabbis of today. Moving into a Jewish world that is going through some pretty significant changes in the way in which it sees itself and operates, somehow that's what rabbinical schools need to be teaching their students. So, for me, I think that when I came to Shomrei Torah Synagogue, there were a lot of financial challenges that I was facing, and I did not get any of that in rabbinical school. There was a practical rabbinics class, but it wasn't about organizational development. It wasn't about management. It wasn't about finances and budgets. It wasn't about all of those things that I needed once I entered into the rabbinate, because the rabbinate is a professional obligation. While it's true that we are first and foremost teachers and pastors, in many ways we're CEOs of an organization and need to have the skills in management and leadership and finance that any other CEO would need to have. And that's one of the reasons why Rabbi Peretz and I have this class that we teach that you were a part of, a number of years ago, which is a practical skills class, an opportunity to give students insights into all of the non-rabbinic functions that they will have to engage in as rabbis of whatever organization they are going to be leading.
It definitely was a great class. And Rabbi Peretz, for everyone listening in, is going to be a guest coming up in the future. So please make sure to check out that episode as well. You talked about it's really a disruptive time kind of for Jewish institutions. Where do you see Jewish institutions, particularly synagogues, kind of going in the next couple of decades?
For sure. I spoke actually about 8 or 9 years ago. I spoke to some of my colleagues about this radical idea of creating a single conservative synagogue of the San Fernando Valley and a single conservative synagogue of the city, and then having a number of branches or satellites of that organization, and as a way of trying to maximize efficiencies and be able to provide for the changing dynamic in Jewish life, which is really about a lack of membership and belonging, and a challenge of people facing Jewish life in a transactional manner, as opposed to in a communal manner. Ron Wolfson, many years ago, was ahead of the curve when he spoke about relational Judaism and the need for synagogues to be places primarily of community. And we see that even more so now, especially with COVID-19. People say, why do I need to belong to a synagogue when I can get my education online, when I can do everything by Zoom, when is a plethora of learning opportunities in this world that have come out from COVID-19. So then what specifically does a synagogue offer? And I think the synagogue offers a sense of belonging, a sense of relationship. It's about the Beit Knesset part of synagogue life more than the Beit Tfilah and the Beit Midrash. And synagogues have to think long and hard about how to redo the aspect of relationships. I remember some years ago, I said to my board of directors, I said, if we want to be cutting edge and successful, we should have one clergy for every 50 families. Now, that is an economic nightmare and an impossibility to create. But the idea behind that was to say that these 50 families, kind of like the Chavarah movement of the 60s, but with rabbinic leadership, to develop a personal relationship with a clergy who can then work with those families and develop meaningful long-term relationships with those people. So there's a deeper intimacy. In many ways, Lewis, like the question you asked me earlier about what was successful about the teen program. I think what was successful about the teen program was that the teenagers knew they can stop by any time, day or night, at our house, hang out with us, sit on the couch, play a game, have a conversation about, Rambam or Jewish ethics, sing together on a Shabbat afternoon. And that's what we need to do for the larger Jewish community as well moving forward. Big synagogues, large, multi-synagogues in many places is not the future of suburban Jewish life.
I definitely see the issue. I've always thought of synagogue as a place more than just a house of study or a house of prayer, but that place of community. And I remember as a kid growing up thinking, wow, Shomrei Torah is so large. And as I went to other synagogues, I don't understand how you keep that sense of community when you have synagogues that can have just thousands and thousands of people. So it's definitely, I love the idea. I agree. It's probably not something, at least as a clergy person, fiscally, we'd want to have one of us for every 50, but it would be tremendous. I'm just imagining what I could do if I had just 50 families I could really get to know and work with in that way.
Yeah, I don't know if you heard the lecture or it was a written article by the Hartman Fellow, Yehuda Kurtzer, where he was speaking about the challenge for the conservative movement facing COVID and the high holidays was to be able to create backyard minyanim of, let's say, 10 families in a neighborhood and provide a tefillah leader for those 10 families, somebody who can help them experience the high holidays, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, in a more intimate setting. And there's something profound about that. I think it's challenging to be able to find the kind of leadership in our communities today, people who are comfortable enough to be able to do that, to gather groups of people together. But that's really going to be the success of our movement going forward and synagogues going forward. Being able to educate people to do much of Jewish practice and worship on their own, and yet build these kind of micro communities within the macro community so that people feel connected to one another and at the same time connected to the source of their learning, which comes from the synagogue. I also think the synagogues of tomorrow need to primarily be outreach centers and to think very differently about models of membership than the way that we have historically understood membership, because people don't need to belong today. And when there are limited financial resources available to people and they need to make very difficult decisions on where to spend their money, synagogues are not at the top of the list. So we have to figure out different ways to monetize and then try to do outreach programs where they are not connected to the synagogue at all, but out in the community where people are at, and bring Judaism into the marketplace that way.
Definitely. It's interesting. I was thinking as you were saying that, right, and I definitely recognize that there are people that synagogue membership can be very difficult financially. But I'm curious, have you seen a shift in priorities amongst families, maybe younger families versus older, in terms of how they spend their money towards Jewish life over your time in the rabbinate?
Well, I do see that raising Jewish children is a very expensive proposition. Jewish summer camps, while they are essential to building strong Jewish identity, oftentimes are very expensive. And the Jewish community in Los Angeles has done a pretty good job of raising funds to offset those costs. But I know that if money wasn't a factor, I'd have dozens more families going to sending their kids to Jewish summer camp. Day schools, while I think are essential to the life of a Jewish community, are so ridiculously priced out of the ballpark for middle class families that it makes it almost impossible for those families to say, I want to give my kids a strong Jewish day school education, because they just can't. So I think the high cost of Jewish education is probably one of the strongest blocks to building continued Jewish life.
Wow. It's one of, I think, maybe the benefits of the situation we find ourselves in now is access to Jewish learning as it's moved virtually has made it a lot easier for a lot of people, not just financially, but congregants that are homebound, or people who it's harder to drive to get places, or even just for me, the pleasure of being able to learn from colleagues in other states and countries. It's really been tremendous. So speaking a little bit more about COVID and how it's impacted the synagogue, what have you found has been really successful in a way of staying connected without necessarily being in the building for programs?
Yeah, from the beginning, my cantor, Jackie Raffi, and I started creating these weekly, what we called spiritual conversations. And while hers is framed around music, mine is framed around Jewish learning. And so we spend some time, before each of those Zoom sessions, speaking about where people are at. What are the oys and what are the joys? What's on their mind? How are they managing whatever new crisis is in the news, whether it's COVID or whether it's race relations or whatever it may be that creates a certain amount of anxiety in people's lives. And then what I try to do, and what my cantor tries to do, is pick a topic that seems relevant to whatever's happening in most people's psyche in relationship to what's happening in the world today, and frame that topic through the lens of Jewish wisdom. And it's remarkable. I know you're going to ask because you shared with me, a question at the end as we, come to the conclusion about what's a favorite text of mine, and I must say that, what I have discovered in teaching these spiritual conversation classes every week is there are Jewish texts that address everything, right? There is nothing that's happening in our lives today or will be happening in our lives tomorrow that have not in some way been addressed by the wisdom of our tradition. That's what makes our tradition so remarkably flexible and attenuated to where we are at right now. So that's one of the things that we've done, which has given people a great deal of comfort and connection. The other thing that we've done is just been present. We've changed the nature of our tefillah so that people will be able to sit on Zoom and participate. We've created virtual Kiddush breakout rooms for people so that they can stay connected to one another, even though they can't be in the presence of one another. We've tried to create a series of social fun kinds of things on Sunday evenings, whether they were movie nights or wine tasting or trivia games, that kind of stuff, so that each week and each month that we've been going through this, we've tried to come up with creative ways to say to our community, we're here, we know you're there, we can't be together in person, but we're going to make sure that we are as accessible to you and that you can be as accessible to one another as you were when we were meeting in the building.
One of the things you said before is the idea that our tradition speaks about everything, and there's no situation it doesn't talk about. And I can definitely relate to that. One of my favorite topics in rabbinical school was bioethics and halakha and technology, because we were talking about topics that the rabbis of old couldn't have even dreamed up, that my great grandparents couldn't have even dreamed up. And yet, our texts have something to say about driverless cars, about lab-grown meat, about all of these types of things. But one of the difficulties, actually, there's a book I found a number of years ago that I always found fascinating. It's a collection of Civil War sermons from rabbis on both sides of the argument. So they can take the same parsha and they can have very different conclusions from it. So how do you deal with that as a rabbi when it comes to political topics, when our tradition really could be used to speak in either direction on so many issues? How do you balance that of teaching the tradition and not pushing any particular political agenda?
Oh, it's unbelievably difficult. It's not easy, and it's like a minefield for rabbis today because congregants expect, in many ways, that their synagogue is going to support in some way their political positions, and they want their religious community to reflect those political positions that they take. And given that we are living in such a polarized world today, oh, I'm sorry, my phone is ringing, and there's a tendency sometimes for it to answer onto my computer with a little bit of dinging. So there may be a little bit of dinging noise in the background that I forgot to turn off earlier. But, living in such a polarized world today, it's impossible for the synagogue to meet the needs of everybody to be able to speak to what their political positions are. You just can't do it. I do agree with you, though. I think our tradition is broad enough that, there's that wonderful midrash that says when God revealed the Torah to the children of Israel at Sinai, it was like a series of mirrors that were refracted so that each person who experienced revelation in the capacity that they were able to understand it and then were able to frame going forward their worldview from the experience of revelation. But that means, Louis, that what I, Richard Camras, experienced at Sinai looks differently than what Louis Sachs experienced at Sinai, and therefore I frame my worldview from that perspective of how I understand Torah. And when I look at issues of immigration and healthcare and race relations and all those other kinds of things, I'm going to read Torah in a certain way that may look very different than the way that you read Torah. So I haven't specifically answered your question yet, which is very typical of rabbis to say a lot and not answer the question. But I would say that I try to step carefully. There are moments where I have found that I have to say something, and I try to say something in a manner that reflects nuance, and frame it within the context of traditional texts. But I know that sometimes I'm going to alienate some numbers of my community by giving a sermon or sharing a point of view that not everybody agrees with. Hopefully, I have built strong enough relationships with my community that they understand that while we may disagree around certain issues of great political import, that doesn't in any way lessen the care, the compassion, and the concern I have for each and every individual member of our community, and that we collectively want what's the very best for our country.
I love it. It's great that this issue also kind of came back at the end to that idea of relationships. That really I think is one of the foundational tools that a rabbi has. Something that I've seen in my 3 years is building relationships. It works in so many different ways and is central. As we get ready to end our time together, I would love to go back to that question of what is a piece of Torah, some teaching that has really stayed with you over the years in a deep way?
So I, do a lot of personal meditation, and amongst the texts that I use, there's one text in particular, and I've shared with my congregation, at various times, that this happens to be a favorite of mine. Um, but again, I would preface that by saying so much of what my favorite text may be is framed in whatever may be going on in my life or in the life of my community or the world at a given time. But one text in particular that I always go back to is the line from Bereshit when our father Yaakov wakes up from the dream and says, "Achen yesh Adonai b'makom hazeh v'anochi lo yadati." And there's so much wisdom in that one verse. Like, in English, wow. He wakes up from this dream and he says, God was in this place and I didn't know it. That's a text that speaks very deeply to me because, for one, one of the many names of God in our tradition is Makom. And Makom means place. And the text is reminding us that there is no place without God. And there is only God in this world. And and that's all that this world is God. And while we live in a certain reality of separation, that we need to live in this somewhat mystical, fictionalized world that I am me and you are you, and each one of us is an independent entity from a mystical standpoint, and from looking at that text as makom, all there is God. And everything else is a figment of our imagination. And how can we live in a world where everything is identified with God and godliness? And how do I approach another human being and see in that other human being the face of God? And one of the ways to be able to do that is in that verse, there's an extra I, va'anochi lo yadati. And there's a tradition that says, in my eye got in the way of me knowing that God was in this place. And if I can remove my eye from the way I see the world, then there's more room for me to be able to experience the other, which is ultimately the face of God infinitely expressed. So how do I walk this world? By limiting, by reducing, by constricting, by contracting my eye to make room for the way that God appears in this world in the face of every other human being and every other creature. And how can I constantly be awake to that moment? I spend a lot of time teaching Musar in my congregation, and I think there is no better text for Musar than Achen yesh Adonai b'makom hazeh v'anochi lo yadati.
Wow. It's a great verse, and it's a great thought that we need to make space for others and to see the sanctity in each other and in the world. One of the benefits I've seen, I hate to say benefits when it comes to COVID, but the positives maybe that's come out of it is I think people really thought of the synagogue as where I go to be Jewish. And now when I look around on Minyan, I see people in their bedroom, in their living room, in their kitchen, in their backyard, davening. And it's really a treat to see that all these places have been places for people to encounter God, for people to pray, that are beyond just the four walls of our sanctuaries. I want to thank you so much, Rabbi, for being on. It's a treat to have you with us. One of the things going to rabbinical school did was I got to know rabbis very personally, and it made them human beings to me. But again, I still feel like I'm 4 feet tall, staring up at you on the bima there. Not just because you are still a couple of feet taller than me, but I go right back to being 13. So thank you so much, Rabbi. It's a pleasure to share my rabbi, the rabbi who brought me where I am today with my community. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Rabbi Sachs, for giving me the opportunity to share with you. And I must say that I am sure there are going to be any number of young children growing up in your congregation who will look up to you on the bima and see themselves as 4 feet tall, and one day be able to say that it's because of Rabbi Sachs that I am the person that I am the young adult that I am, and I am so grateful to the experiences that I had under his warm leadership that led me to who I've become as a Jew. So continued Hatzlacha to you and your community in Toronto, and I look forward to visiting you when you're back in LA.
Thank you. And to everyone who tuned in and watched, again, thank you so much, and we'll see you next
If you don't love your neighbor, if you gossip about him, if you never have mercy, if he gets into trouble and you don't try to help him,